Hello, BookTube. Welcome to my kitchen. Little interlude here. I'm about to record another Middlemarch meditations after lunch. That's what I'm doing right now, making lunch. But before I do that, I realized that I forgot to say something when I was talking about the prelude in the previous meditations, and I think it's fairly important, so I'm just going to mention it. You'll remember that I was quoting from the prelude, that sentence which says, "Many Teresas have been born who found for themselves no epic life wherein there was a constant unfolding of far resonant action." And now I didn't go on from that. I sort of said, perhaps there'll be a life of mistakes, the offspring of a certain spiritual grandeur ill-matched with meanness of opportunity. So I was talking about, it's possible to be a very capable woman, but if you don't get the opportunities to show that capability, if you aren't really given the chance to learn and to grow and to make decisions, then what you're going to do is just make mistakes. But it's the next phrase which I meant to kind of riff on, and I didn't. Eliot goes on to say, "Perhaps a tragic failure which found no sacred poet and sank unwept into oblivion." Now that's interesting, and it made me think as soon as I read it about Cleopatra. There's been a lot in the news recently about Cleopatra. Everybody wants Cleopatra, and it's funny because she was a not very long note in one Roman historian's writings. And you know how incredibly interested we've been in the late 20th, early 21st century about Roman historians, right? We haven't been. Classical history has it's no longer a required study subject, so it fades out of our consciousness. And if we only knew about Cleopatra from Roman historians, then I suspect nobody would be fighting about Cleopatra now, because she just would be a non-entity, an unknown. The reason we fight about Cleopatra is because Shakespeare gave her the celebrity that she's got. She would simply not be the kind of cultural figure that anybody even cared about. That people would go, you can have Cleopatra if you want her. Who's Cleopatra anyway? But what Shakespeare started, other artists picked up on and elaborated and riffed on. This happens so often in art. And so Cleopatra's mistakes, maybe not choosing the best political tactics, but I don't know that she had a lot of options. We don't really know. There's not a lot except one Roman historian's writings, and not a lot either. I mean, paragraphs, really. Shakespeare filled it out. Shakespeare gave Cleopatra life, gave her celebrity. In a sense, she kind of owes that to him. And I don't think that people really think about that. We just think, oh yeah, Cleopatra, she's always been incredibly famous. No, I don't think she has. I think she would have been just one of those little footnotes that only a classical historian would know about, and they'd wax eloquent about this incredible Egyptian queen. I wonder what she was like. She was so young, and she did this and she did this, and everybody around would just think, aren't academic specialists really boring when they go off on some silly subject that only they know and only they would know. And so that's just my little added tidbit to the prelude, is that effectively I think Eliot's saying, some women, their achievements only get noticed because some man decides that he'll write a poem about it, because otherwise they would be mistakes nobody even knows about now. Nobody even knows about. I'll talk to you later when I'm ready to do the next section of the meditation. Okay? Take care. Bye-bye. Hey, BookTube. So, lunch is over. We're now back in my little office where I do most of my recording, because the person who watches television is watching television. So, need to find a quieter space to do these recordings. So we're going to go on to chapter 1 of Middlemarch, and I do have page text here, which I'll pop up on screen. I'll try not to get behind it. I noticed I was doing a lot of this last recording, wasn't I? I've just got to get more sophisticated. Realize, I've got to stay where I am. When I've set myself up on camera, I've got to stand still and just talk through the text itself. So with chapter 1, a lot of things occur to me. So I'm going to go, I think about 4 or 5 things I'm going to go through in order according to my notes. I mean, the first one is the quote, which comes just before the chapter starts. Since I can do no good because a woman, reach constantly at something that is near it. And this quote is from the 17th century play, The Maid's Tragedy. I hadn't heard of it before, and so I did download a Kindle version from Project Gutenberg, have a quick read. It was... I don't find other dramatists, Elizabethan or Jacobean. It's really difficult if you love Shakespeare to find many other dramatists' verse palatable. I didn't find it great verse. Now, I may be wrong because I have already confessed to my strange, fraught relationship with poetry. I have no problem with Shakespeare. Shakespeare I adore. Absolutely adore. Have problems with other people. Maybe that's just because I don't know them well enough. I hold that in suspense. It's possible that it's me and not the play. But just for your information, I'm going to read, I've got here on screen, the Concise Oxford Companion to English Literature, and this is what they have to say about the play The Maid's Tragedy. I'll read it. Amintor, a gentleman of Rhodes, breaks his engagement to Aspatia at the king's request and marries Evadne, sister to his friend Melanthius. Try and keep all those names together, right? So, on their wedding night, Evadne reveals that she is the king's mistress and refuses to sleep with Amintor. Amintor agrees that he'll conceal the whole business, but he does later reveal the truth to Evadne's brother, Melanthius. And of course, Melanthius then goes and tells off Evadne. You can begin to see where this kind of story is going, right? And Melanthius persuades his sister to go murder the king. This all sounds like fantastic advice. Meanwhile, Aspatia, the poor girl who was going to marry Amintor, but was, put to one side because he needed to marry a woman because the king wanted him to. She's lamenting her loss, and apparently she produces some of the finest verse in the play, so I should probably just go straight to her lines because I didn't find anybody else's verse all that exciting. So Aspatia decides that she's going to disguise herself as her brother. We don't know who that brother is, but never mind. She disguises herself as her own brother, and she provokes Amintor into a duel. I'm not sure on what pretense, but there you go. I guess because he turned down, yeah, of course it is. If Aspatia is pretending to be her brother is probably mad at Amintor because he didn't marry her, and maybe he suspects that his sister is no longer pure, and those kind of things did lead to duels. Right, so Amintor wounds this person he thinks is Aspatia's brother, but is Aspatia. And as Aspatia is lying, dying, Evadne arrives, right? Fresh from the king's murder. And she hopes that, by telling him this fact, she'll be pardoned by her husband Amintor. But no, he rejects her. And so she commits suicide. And then at that point, Aspatia reveals who she really is and dies. And you can imagine this leaves Amintor without a wife, without the woman that he wanted to make his wife, and so he commits suicide. There we go. What a lovely, cheery Jacobean play that sounds to be. But you can see the position of the women in this play. How little agency they really had to do anything. The fact that there's even a storyline whereby the king has a mistress and he thinks, I'm going to make this man marry her. I know that he's not in love with her, but I'm the king. So, end of. So I suppose you could also argue that, in the lower orders, there's a class aspect to it as well. Amintor, although he's a gentleman, he has to keep the king sweet. So if the king says, I need you to marry this woman, he's going to marry that woman. So he's a little bit helpless as well. But I think the women, you can see them trying desperately to take action
which, if in a way, none of the men actually are. Now, maybe this is where Eliot is drawn to this play, because if you think of the storyline, Amyntor just does what he's told. Melanthius, Evadne's brother, he just tells his sister off. He tells her to murder the king. Oh, not you then, Melanthius. Your sister's got to do it. Okay, fine. So Aspasia, in the meanwhile, she decides, she takes action. She disguises herself as her brother and challenges the man who should have been her husband to a duel. So she actually does something she's probably never done before, probably has no training in. So that perhaps goes back to the prelude, lots of passion and determination to do something great, but no real opportunity because, no experience fighting, therefore most likely to die in a duel. Never mind, so she dies. Evadne, for all the action that she takes, isn't accepted. But you just think, what on earth can the women do right? Can they do anything right, I wonder? Or are they pretty much condemned by the state of things? And the only thing that you're kind of pleased about is that the king is dead. Now, the play was written in 1619. And me is thinking to myself, because I'm trying to think, just one moment while I look something up. Okay, so 1619 was 7 years before Charles I came to the throne. So we're definitely still with King James of Scotland. But it is interesting that on the English stage there should be a play where really the only one who deserved to die in this play was the king. For creating such a horrendous, heartbreaking situation as to force a man to marry a woman he'd never thought of marrying, and and a woman that the king has already been sleeping with. I am going off on a tangent, but I think it's interesting that Eliot pulls out this play, because I'd never heard of it before, so I've not heard that it's been staged a great deal. Maybe it has, but it's called The Maid's Tragedy. And I just thought, okay, is this what we're being set up for? The fact that, unmarried women, can they win? Can they win no matter who they are or what they've got? Can they ever win? That's interesting. I'm going to bear that in mind. So, coming back to Middlemarch now. So you can see that quote sort of heads things. It's like, wow. So, unmarried women, what are your chances in life, given the situation? The second thing that I noticed right away was that we're introduced to our main character right away. Mill on the Floss. The Mill on the Floss is such a different book. There's still a very strong, unusual, passionate female character, but the Mill on the Floss, and the entire first chapter is devoted, is devoted to describing the landscape, and in particular the River Floss. So the river is almost, the protagonist of the book, and Maggie Tulliver, who's very much like the river. It's almost like she represents something. That's a much more difficult book to wrap your head around in terms of what exactly is Eliot doing. With Middlemarch, it seems a little more straightforward, because we are starting right off with Miss Brooke, right, everyone, in case you're not sure who the book's about, what the book's about, we're getting straight into it. Miss Brooke. And such a formal, you can see me saying formal, no first name given. And I did notice that, of course, her sister, Celia, is introduced immediately by her first name. Now, I know, obviously, it would be awkward to introduce both of them as Miss Brooke. Miss Brooke the elder and Miss Brooke the younger. You wouldn't do that. But at the same time, why not simply say Dorothea? Dorothea had that kind of beauty, but instead you say Miss Brooke. Miss Brooke. I suppose you are immediately emphasizing the fact that she is not married. And, of course, since she has a younger sister, do they actually say that Celia is younger? I believe this. I feel as though I saw this, but her sister had more common sense. Celia... None of which sister says. I'm going to suppose that I have seen that somewhere. If I spot it again, I'll say. Nevertheless, if one of them is a Miss Brooke, the other one is probably a Miss Brooke as well, by the sounds of it. But it's interesting that You have to get to page 2. This page that we are reading now does not name Miss Brooke, does not give you her first name, even though it spends a great deal of time describing, here we go, Miss Brooke's appearance. Again, since we're talking about what chance do unmarried women have, well, what we're laying out in these next few pages is what assets Miss Brooke comes with in terms of what she is as an unmarried woman in the 19th century. So an unmarried woman in the 19th century was valuable on 2 counts, possibly three counts. I sound like Monty Python's Spanish Inquisition. Sorry, that was not intended. She has assets on 3 counts. And of course, the first one, the overriding and very, very important one, is the kind of beauty she has. It's very important for women to have some beauty. Otherwise, how on earth are they ever going to get married? They make this quite clear, so you can just see where this is coming from. And they take a great deal of time to describe the specific nature of Miss Brooke's beauty. It's a beauty that seems to do best when it's not greatly decorated, which is, I suppose it's admirable in a way. I do like how they say that her stature and bearing seemed to gain the more dignity from her plain garments, which by the side of provincial fashion gave her the impressiveness of a fine quotation from the Bible or from one of our elder poets in a paragraph of today's newspaper. In other words, if you stood Miss Brooke beside your average, sillier woman, dressed in much more frills and lace and bits and bobs, I guess the other woman would look like just the page of a newspaper. She would be that outstanding. And Miss Brooke, on the other hand, would look like you'd inserted a quotation from the Bible. In other words, she would stand out with just that great dignity. So it's so far reasonably complimentary. Then it goes on to say she was usually spoken of as being remarkably clever. And perhaps that's interesting because although she had this incredible kind of beauty, how is she mostly spoken of? Well, she's mostly spoken of as being clever. So in other words, people have noticed her intelligence. And Eliot goes on to say, in perfect comic irony, but with the addition that her sister Celia had more common sense. Heaven only knows what common sense meant in those days, as opposed to being clever. We have an understanding of it now, I suppose, because we talk about people being book clever and street smart. So in other words, basically Celia was clever. Her common sense probably consisted of knowing what her culture expected of her and making sure that she worried about that more than, exclusive to anything else. And obviously Miss Brooke's problem was that silly woman, she didn't think any of her culture's expectations were worth that much attention. And she had better things to set her mind on. Poor thing. So that's the second thing I noticed. And of course, class. Yes, class. So she has beauty. Beauty is an asset. She has class because it talks about the pride of being ladies. The Brooke connections, though not exactly aristocratic, were unquestionably good. Very important, good connections. If you inquired backward for a generation or two, oh my goodness, yeah, so eugenical, you would not find any yard measuring or parcel tying forefathers. Well, goodness, no, you wouldn't. Anything lower than an admiral or clergyman, there's your bottom layer, right? There's your bottom layer of respectable society. You could be in the church or you can be in the army, but below that, that's another type of person, I guess, another type of person altogether. So she's got those 2 things going for her. She's got looks, she's got class, and we'll wait for a minute to talk about the other asset that's on the next page. What I want to do is just pull down the page here because, let's see if I can do this. No, of course I can't, because I'm not on the right image. There we go. Pull down the page like this. And you can see my note at the top. I went and looked up the 2 names, even though I'm a little ahead of myself because we don't actually see Dorothea's name till the next page. But you will note the meanings of the 2 sisters' names. So in other words, Dorothea means gift of God, and Celia comes from Cecilia, and means blind. So it coded into this wonderful first page where we are learning about Miss Brooke's assets, but we're learning that, her sister has so much common sense. It's like, in other words, her sister is blind to the fact that there's anything else in life besides what people expect of her. She's simply going to carry that out. But already there's an uneasiness in here. You wondering how Miss Brooke is going to do. She doesn't have that common sense. What's going to happen? And if you look further, there's also something else here that's a little bit sad, but we have to just bring down the page, because here's one of the key things. So of course we've talked about how there's nothing lower in their family than an admiral or a clergyman. It says there was even an ancestor discernible as a Puritan gentleman who served under Cromwell, but afterwards conformed. Oh, go. Yeah. It's funny from reading Christopher Hill, The World Turned Upside Down, to read his final chapters where he talks about the number of men who wanted reform in Cromwell's time, and then when the monarchy was restored, they had to find a place for themselves. I think that's what made me regret that John Milton is still my literary white whale, because Milton suffered so much. Knowing the strength of his faith and his conviction that the world was going to change when Cromwell took over, and then his disillusionment and how he had to try and deal with it. So the problem is that by mentioning this business of having an ancestor who was a Puritan who served under Cromwell, immediately I thought, oh, okay, this heritage is going to, they're already suggesting that there are things that are genetic, just having this good family. But of course, having this Puritan strain, they're going to mention it again, and I will talk about that when we get on to page 2. Okay, actually, I say page 1, 2. That's not really fair. I did tell you what version I was using, didn't I? I said I was using the Penguin Classics. So we're actually looking at pages 7 and 8 in that version. I got to be careful, right? This is what happens when I don't script. I get stuff wrong. But if you can tolerate that, then we'll keep on going. I'm going to just put up, this is the top of page 8. Top of page 8. My scribble, because there's already an irony happening here. This is comparing Dorothea with her sister Celia, and talking about how much more religious Dorothea is, and it says about Celia that Celia mildly acquiesced in all her sister's sentiments. In other words, she agreed with Miss Brooke, but she couldn't possibly get as excited. And it says why. It says, with that common sense which is able to accept momentous doctrines without any eccentric agitation. And I just... it was a magnificent sentence, and my notes at the top say this, just a second. How can that be sensible? How can that be common sense? If you are truly talking about momentous doctrines, things that really do affect life, death, eternity, if such things are true, then there is no such thing as an eccentric agitation. So I said, either the momentous things are not momentous, or common sense isn't very sensible. It's or maybe it's a bit of both. But it's just so lovely that Celia you could say to her, Celia, Armageddon is coming, and all men are going to die a terrible death unless they repent and fast for a week. I could just see Celia going, I might go without my breakfast, because you want to be commonsensical about it, right? But if Armageddon really is coming, doing without your breakfast isn't going to cut it, no matter how well-meaning you might be. But there you go. It's setting up the irony. Like, which of these two women, what do you make of them? They are an interesting pair. And it's just unfortunate, I suppose, that Miss Brooke is fixating on religion. But then they go on to explain a little bit of why. And that's why I'm scrolling up the page slowly here. It talks about how Dorothea knew many passages of Pascal's Pensées. Now, this is talking about Blaise Pascal. And what I think is interesting, again, about these 2 pages is that the literature that Eliot is either quoting or she's name dropping the authors. They all come from the 17th century, and that's interesting given the whole Puritan thing that she also wants to drop in. That effectively, maybe she's trying to set up Miss Brooke as kind of the female Cromwell, except maybe she won't succeed even to the degree that Cromwell did. But bear that in mind. That's another thing. You know how I talked about pinning things. You always keep like a mental pin board when you read a work like this of classic, because that nothing is written down that probably doesn't mean something later. So pin it up there. Is Dorothea Brooke going to be a literary form of Cromwell? Is she going to be a fictional female Cromwell, someone who tries to revolutionize how things are for women? Which, the truth to be known, there were a lot of Puritans. If you go back and listen to my review of Christopher Hill's The World Turned Upside Down, there were plenty of Puritans who believed that equality for women was something that needed to happen as far back as, the middle 1600s. And unfortunately, the restoration of the monarchy meant those ideas really didn't get entertained for very long. So she's read Concise and she's read Jeremy Taylor. Now, I did look up Jeremy Taylor, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to do this live. Jeremy Taylor, who was a cleric. Of course he was. He was a cleric, and he was born in 1613 and died in 1667. Yeah, cleric in the Church of England, and he achieved fame as an author during the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. So there we go. So in other words, he was on the side of the Puritans, and she's reading his writings as well. So this is interesting because to read Blaise Pascal and to read Jeremy Taylor, they're going to inflame the passions. A woman who has nothing else that she's allowed to do or submerge her mind into except religious literature is going to get a very serious idea. It's going to be something that she's going to want to put passion into. So, of course, it says that, because of this intense interest that she has in religious matters, she's not so excited about fashion. And it mentions a couple of different, that made the solicitudes of feminine fashion appear an occupation for bedlam. In other words, as far as Dorothea Brooke was concerned, all this fuss about hair and clothing, you might as well be a crazy person to even bother yourself. So that showed with her religious interest. She was a Puritan, right down to her fingernails, definitely trying for a whole different kind of life. So, in other words, she could not reconcile the anxieties of a spiritual life involving eternal consequences. With a keen interest in guimpe. I'm not sure how you say this. In French, I believe you would say guimpe. And this was a strange little garment. This was a blouse worn under a dress. So in other words, there would be dresses cut so that they would be sleeveless and sort of very scoop-necked, be a bit low cut. So obviously you couldn't wear that dress by itself; it would show off too much skin. So what you did was you purchased a guimpe, and that would be a pretty little blouse that would go underneath the dress and cover all those bits, that the dress didn't cover. We just think, well, couldn't you just make the dress? Never mind. Couldn't you just make the dress modest to begin with? But it's almost, there is something into it which is making me smile. Because both these items, the guimpe is almost a tease. Because it's almost saying, look how little this dress actually covers. But, I've got a little shirt on underneath it. So there was a bit of a tease going on there. And then, of course, also those artificial protrusions of drapery. Now, Eliot would be writing this in the middle of the 19th century. And I'm trying to remember when the bustle became a thing. So effectively, women changed the shape of their bodies in the back with a horsehair and wire contraption called a bustle, and so their dress stuck out at the back and was flat in the front. But 19th century fashion was crazy in terms of the number of silhouettes it created. You had the bell silhouette around the time, I believe, of the coronation of Victoria, where the bodice is very, very fitted to the waist, and then boom, the skirt just is like an umbrella turned upside down, or a bowl, and so there was always something in fashion that one was supposed to be concerning oneself with if they had the money to do so. But obviously to Dorothea, this is all just a complete waste of good effort. And if you go down the page, let's see, do I still have the page? There we go. I've got to get this right. This is where, of course, I think it finally does say her name, doesn't it? Where does it finally say Dorothy's name on this page? But it was the first time they finally name her. But this now they talk about the fact that both of these girls, both Celia and Dorothea, are actually orphans. They're not being brought up by their parents. They've been brought up by a very kindly older uncle. He's about 60, so he would have been a father of older children had he had any children. Perhaps his children were grown up. We'll wait to find that out. So then it goes on to describe him, and the description she's giving of old Mr. Brooke is really making me think a lot of Mr. Bennet in Austen's Pride and Prejudice. A little, only in the fact that he's very easygoing. What's it? I can't read the screen, so I'm going to have to actually read the text in the book. He's a man of acquiescent temper, miscellaneous opinions, and uncertain vote. Oh, there we go. Cool. I'm not sure that Mr. Bennet would necessarily be of uncertain vote. I think Mr. Bennet would keep a lot of his opinions to himself, but Mr. Bennet had a very acquiescent temper. And and apparently people held that he had a too rambling habit of mind. Mr. Brooke's conclusions were as difficult to predict as the weather. Well, that struck me as a little bit Mr. Bennet. Just a little bit. That there was a tendency, I think, in Jane Austen to create a Bennet father who was just a little bit deficient in what fathers are supposed to be not deficient in. They're supposed to be protectors, providers, and they're supposed to know how to do that really, really well. And of course, I think what Pride and Prejudice illustrates is that not all men are very good at that. And I think perhaps Eliot's setting up something similar here. Here's old Mr. Brooke. He's a man, so Victorian society would say without question he's a capable provider and protector. And you're beginning to wonder, okay, well we'll keep watching. We'll keep watching and see if that turns out to be true. And so having described him, now it's at the bottom of the page that I just want to skip down to, because here it does say quite clearly, right down at the bottom, in Mr. Brooke, the hereditary strain of Puritan energy was clearly in abeyance. In other words, missing. We would never meet Mr. Brooke and go, there's somebody descended from a Puritan. There's someone who's on fire for whatever faith it is. Here we go, Dorothea. Now we finally go. But in his niece, Dorothea, it glowed alike through faults, and if you go to the next page, it says through faults and virtues. In other words, whether Dorothea was being stupid or being smart, she was religiously being stupid or being smart. That made me smile, because I can confess here that for many years I did attend an evangelical Christian church, and it's funny to think back. I left that in 1999, so you can see it's been 24 years since I last believed in God. Never mind, did everything I was told to do. But it's very strange, because you can remember being two very different people. Like, I know who I am now, but I remember there was that very different other person who was a little bit like that, a little bit glowed alike through faults and virtues. Go telling myself, sadly, that to me is the one downside of faith, is that faith can, I'm not going to say definitely does, but it's very easy for it to be a substitute for good judgment. Very easy, because faith can provide lots of little rules, depending on where you're getting that from and where you're getting your instruction from. You can be provided with a lot of little rules that you simply follow without thinking. And it's odd, though, because effectively you see Celia's kind of doing the same thing. Celia is blindly following rules, but they're not religious rules. They're society's rules for how she ought to be as a middle-class, unmarried woman in England. So she's got all those down. She knows how to do those. What Dorothea has added to that is she also has this religious fervor, which probably means that she's going to make some mistakes based on those rules. But there we go. I'm digressing really. Now I haven't put the other page on, so let's just take a second while I load page 9. Okay, look, I have disappeared, but don't worry. I just felt that I only wanted to catch just the top of page 9, and then we'll carry on with another meditation later. This is just going on to talk about, we talked about Dorothea having assets. We talked about her family background being an asset, her beauty being an asset. But now here at the top of page 9, we've got what is the real clincher. She was regarded as an heiress, for not only did the sisters have, not only did the sisters have $700 a year each from their parents, but if Dorothea married and had a son, that son would inherit Mr. Brooke's estate, that is her biological father's estate, presumably worth about $3,000 a year. Now that's a huge amount. If that's 13, what was that? 3,700. That's an incredible estate. So it says a rental which seemed wealth to provincial families. Apparently they were discussing. We won't go into detail about Mr. Peel's late conduct on the Catholic question. I might look into that and see if it has any relevance that I can think of. If it does, we'll make another video. Don't worry. And so, of course, the next paragraph says, how should Dorothea not marry? Yeah, how should she? Because she's got class, she's got looks, she's got money. Those are the women that get married. That's not a problem. But, of course, Eliot says, well, nothing could hinder it but her love of extremes and her insistence on regulating life according to notions which might cause a wary man to hesitate. So now we've set this situation up. We have got the perfectly marriageable woman according to the standards of the 19th century. She's beautiful. She is not, she doesn't spend a lot of money on her clothes. We already know she wears very plain clothes, but she's so stunning that she shows them off perfectly. She comes from a very good family. You can trace her ancestors back a few generations, and you will only find that people doing the right kind of jobs. That was so important. Or basically not doing jobs. The better off you were, the less work you actually did. And finally, of course, she had money. And if you married her and if you could get a son, then voila, you would hit the jackpot, because you would get Mr. Brooke's estate, which is worth a very tidy sum indeed. So she has everything going for her. And I like how Eliot has set this up, because I can contrast it with The Mill on the Floss, where she created Maggie Tulliver, who was stunning. Absolutely stunning in terms of her looks. She was stunning. However, she had absolutely no money. Her family was not well off. They were not doing well at all. And that immediately put her at a huge disadvantage. And also, she didn't necessarily come from a great family. She did on her mother's side. Her mother was sort of genteel, working people. So that was all right. But her father's family were known to be a bit of trouble. And so she had background disadvantages and wealth disadvantages. So yes, she had the beauty, but that wasn't enough given the other two things. But with Dorothea, you've got a completely different package. She's got everything. She is set up. But what they're saying here is there's something about Dorothea that is going to make it hard to turn her into a married woman. So with that, I think we're going to stop today's meditation, and we'll carry on another time. But thanks so much. I'm really enjoying sharing this on video, and I hope you're getting something from it. I'm about to do a non-fiction review, so basically I'm going to switch the camera off, change everything up, and get ready to talk about a completely different book. But I'll look forward to checking in with you guys then. Take care. Bye-bye.